In today's session, we're going to start out with a very brief review of the complex concepts of positive and negative reinforcement and some of the qualities that go along with reinforcement, and then spend some time examining why we engage in behaviors that are bad for us and why we fail to engage in some of those behaviors that are really good for us. And then we proceed to dwell on a topic that is really an area of trouble for a lot of managers: discipline. Something managers don't like to do. Actually, none of us like to get in that situation where we have to confront somebody and tell them something that's unpleasant. And then finally, we're going to take a look at a very efficient way to learn. It's the last model of learning that we'll look at, observational learning. But first, the quick review. Positive reinforcement, we said last time, is reinforcement of behavior by using a pleasant event or thing. And the behavior increases by the presence of this pleasant reinforcement. We like attention, we like candy, we like money. This is fairly easy to grasp, but it's the companion piece, negative reinforcement, strengthening a behavior by something that's aversive and unpleasant. How does that happen? Well, there are, as we talked about last time, a number of our behaviors that are sustained, that are strengthened by negative reinforcers. We do a lot of things in life to avoid unpleasantness. And so many of our behaviors, really good social behaviors, good manners, are sustained by our desire to avoid guilt, our desire to avoid anxiety, our desire to avoid shame, embarrassment, nervousness, pain, and hard effort. So it sort of sets us on the path of a lot of things. Things that we do to avoid feeling guilty. We don't hurt people because we'd feel guilty afterwards. We're honest. We don't cheat. We don't steal, usually. And we can look at perhaps some of the reinforcements later on for people who do. Because we don't want to feel these really negative, unpleasant emotions. So to avoid these things, we engage in these, what we call pro-social behaviors. Okay, so our behaviors then are essentially a consequence of the combination of things. Of positive reinforcements, we do things for things that we want. We want attention from people. We want people's approval. We want a good paycheck. So we do things for those reasons. We want recognition. We want feelings of achievement, and that pushes us along one line. And it's the old carrot and stick approach. After we get the carrots, there's much of our behavior that we engage in to avoid the sticks in life. A few other things about reinforcement that we want to go over very briefly, just before we move into the whole area, particularly of discipline, but also an area that I call traps and fences. When we looked at reinforcement last time, we looked at some qualities of reinforcement. And I just want to review with you the qualities. Immediate versus delayed. Immediate works better. Contrived versus natural or non-contrived. Well, there are lots of things we will do for contrived reinforcers. If you can structure a situation so that the activity is its own reinforcement, if you get to that point in life where you love your work and engaging in work is like engaging in play, that there's something about it that really captures our attention and our interest and our motivation, then the work itself becomes its own reinforcer. Just doing it and the feelings that we get from achieving in it and succeeding for it and the fact that it's interesting. In that case, engaging in work has built into it non-contrived reinforcers. But we can't depend on that because you may not get there immediately in a job, and there are too many jobs out there which just frankly aren't very interesting. So we need other reinforcers. Of course, in the sense of fairness and trading our efforts for pay. But pay is a reinforcer. And other things from managers, such as attention. And sometimes other things are added as well. Dress down Fridays. Or employee outings. Everybody gets to go on the cruise or something like that. Or everybody gets to go to the baseball game. All of these are contrived reinforcers that are tossed in the workplace. Size. Well, the bigger the better. But the bigger depends on the last thing that we mentioned, relative to what? For some of us, some of the half the pay, quarter of the pay, fraction of the pay that some people in sports make would be fine for us. But the team compares themselves to the top person. And they look at what they're getting and they look at what somebody else is getting, and sometimes they say, here's somebody on the team who's got a huge contract, getting a lot of money, and isn't even playing in the game, is sitting on the bench most of the time, and I'm out there really working hard. It's not fair. And so the person feels underpaid, even though the person might be making $1 million a year. So relativity counts in all of this as well. Okay, so that is a brief review for where we're going. And where we're going right now is to get an understanding of why we engage in some behaviors that are bad for us, and why can't we work up the energy to do those things that we know are really good for us. The first behavior, if we can go to the computer screen, is called a trap. Behaviors with short-term gain, long-term pain. Clearly, smoking is something like that. There is immediate reinforcement for smoking. And the pain for smoking is going to come 20 or 30 years later. If the minute you lit up, you started coughing and you came down with cancer, you wouldn't smoke so fast. Same thing with eating candy. One rotten piece of candy, what's it going to do to you? It is so delicious at the moment. And so is the next piece. And so is one more piece after that. And soon, 3/4 of the box is gone. And it does catch up with you, okay? You can't do that for very long without standing on the scale and getting the bad news. And if you don't want to get the bad news from standing on the scale and you put on one of your favorite outfits and it doesn't fit, you get the bad news that way. But it takes a while for that to catch up with you. It doesn't happen right away. If the minute you ate a piece of candy, you bloated, you wouldn't eat that piece of candy. Look at people who are allergic and how they're able to stay away from foods which we think are really fantastic. People who are allergic to chocolate just can't eat chocolate. The reason? As soon as eating it, they get an immediate allergic reaction. So they know they have to stay away from it. So it's that immediacy that figures in, and we fall into these traps time and again. There's another one that we really need to talk about because it is of particular relevance in the workplace and in life in general, called procrastination. Putting it off. Deadlines are motivating. This is quite true. But if the deadline is not near, and sometimes if you're looking at a project that you have to do, the deadline for getting it done is 3 months away, 4 months away? What's going to keep you on target when you know that the next day something isn't due, and the day after that something isn't due either? And maybe you have more pressing deadlines. Or maybe there's something that is immediately reinforcing, like watching a football game, or reading a book, or going shopping, or anything else, or just socializing. It is so easy because all of the things that cause the delay are things that are so immediately reinforcing the short-term gain. So beating that tendency to procrastinate is something that you as a manager are going to have to deal with in the workplace. And you're going to have to deal with it in managing yourself as well, because it's so easy to fall into that. So traps. Very easy for us to slip into these behaviors that have immediate reinforcers, because we don't have to deal with the consequences for a while, sometimes not for a week, or 3 weeks, or 4 weeks, or 40 years. But we do have to deal with them ultimately. And so how to begin to deal with the consequences a bit earlier? Well, the flip side, the opposite of a trap, is a fence. A fence are those behaviors which have either no immediate consequence for you, there's no payoff in it, or it's even maybe mildly aversive, it's mildly unpleasant, and yet long term there is a real gain for it. So what falls into something like that? Well, quickly, flossing your teeth. How many people floss your teeth? Yeah, a few might, or some of us floss just before we go to the dentist. Deadlines, right? We know it's good for us. It doesn't take up that much time. But what are the consequences of it? Well, the effort that you have to put into it, we forget. It's real easy to forget. There is no immediate consequence for it, unless we feel somehow morally superior by doing it. Or there's something caught between your teeth and you have to floss to get it out because it's driving you crazy, in which case there is an immediate payoff. So most of the time we're talking about flossing, no immediate payoff. And so people don't do it. That's why people procrastinate, because engaging in that behavior that would get you closer to the goal, to the project, right at that point in time, has no immediate payoff for you. Studying on early in the semester, the only payoff for you right then and there is knowing that you're keeping up with your work, which would probably feel good, okay, and that you're not going to have to, if you project forward, engage in some horrendous cramming session before exams. You're going to avoid something which is going to be probably painful later on. So if you think of it in those terms, but right at the time you're doing it, it's taking away from doing something else you want to do. Same thing working on projects. And things like engaging in exercise, things that are maybe even mildly aversive, and so we avoid doing them. The effort that you have to engage in to actually start exercising. A lot of people say, well, once they start exercising, it feels okay. Once they get into it, it's fine. It's that getting into it stage that's difficult. And so we avoid doing it. And closely allied with this, and tied into the things that we avoid doing, particularly relevant for managers, is disciplining or punishing subordinates. This is it's a trap that you can fall into, but you need to engage in it. The thought of engaging in disciplining somebody usually leaves us with queasy feelings, feelings of maybe anxiety, feelings of conflict. But you have to get to it. You have to somehow grit your teeth and get past those negative feelings and do what you have to do. Think about the consequences of avoiding it. Well, you're going to wind yourself up with a real mess later on down the line, a much bigger mess than if you had tackled it immediately. Same thing, we can come back with procrastination. You know you have work to do. You have assignments that are due Monday or Tuesday. But Sunday, football games. Well, you'll just look at it for 5 minutes and catch the score. And 5 minutes turns into 15 minutes. And then it'll just be the quarter. And then you'll get back to your work when the ants come on. But the game is so good and it's so engaging, it's got you. And there you are, 3 hours later, haven't got your work done. The remote is in your hand. Your team lost in the end. What did you get out of it? Well, you got 3 hours of doing something that I guess was enjoyable for you. But now you're so much worse off at the end. Okay? So the need to overcome some mild adversity, engage in behaviors, and this is going to happen lots of times in the workplace, not only with seeing that projects are on target, and we'll deal with that later when we deal with goal setting in particular, ways of engineering an environment. Actually, we'll deal with it a little later in our lecture today, how to self-manage yourself so that you can overcome the traps and engage in those behaviors that are good for you. So we've then started with taking a look at discipline. Discipline, punishment, I'm going to use them really interchangeably. What is punishment? Well, it is the application of something aversive, unpleasant, to a behavior, a reprimand. For children, a spanking, docking pay, getting a speeding ticket. It's something designed to eliminate an undesired behavior. It's a consequence that's unpleasant, and it's designed to eliminate it. And conceptually, it is close to, but not the same as, negative reinforcement. The reason it is so easy to get the two mixed up in your head is that they're both unpleasant events. And an event that acts as a negative reinforcer in one situation could actually be a punishment in another situation. What's the difference between the two? How do you keep them straight? Really, when the event is functioning so that it strengthens some behavior by somebody avoiding it, negative reinforcer. If it's operating so that it reduces or eliminates a behavior, punishment. Punishment, reduction, elimination of behavior, negative reinforcer, strengthening, sustaining behavior. Both aversive, both unpleasant, and truly easy to confuse. So if we take a situation of an employee who yaks too much on the telephone in the workplace, something that you could run into frequently enough as a manager. You have to do something about this employee because the employee isn't doing work and is possibly disturbing other employees. So you, in this case, decide you need to publicly reprimand the employee, or maybe privately reprimand. And there are arguments for both. Well, the first thing the employee does is gets off the phone. That's it. End. In that case, it's a punishment. The reprimand has eliminated the talking. Punishment. The next time the employee thinks about talking with a friend at the workplace, gazes up and looks at the boss and says, uh-oh, maybe I'm going to get a reprimand, and cuts the talk short. Okay. The thought of the reprimand now acts as a negative reinforcer, and what it is sustaining, what it is reinforcing, is brief phone conversations. Okay, the actual reprimand itself acted as a punishment, stopped the conversation. The thought of a reprimand can act as a negative reinforcer. Okay, and what it is reinforcing is brief phone conversations. Confusing, I know, okay, but something that we need to deal with. Okay, some first arguments that we need to talk about against punishment and discipline, and then we'll talk about some problems in the process of disciplining. Some arguments against discipline, well, some of the problems in doing it particularly revolve around, and we'll get to some others later, the fact that it often produces undesirable behaviors on the part of the employee. The thing that you worry about most is, are you going to have an employee who becomes fearful? Clearly something you don't want. And the other thing that you have to be concerned about in using punishment and discipline is that you don't start to engage in it for your own self-gratification. It starts to feel good to yell at somebody. Okay, two things that I give you as precautions against using punishment. Okay, but some problems that we can run into in the process of punishing that we really need to be cognizant of. First thing is the punishment truly perceived as being punishment? You reprimand the clerk. For the clerk, is this a punishment, or is this seen as a way to gain attention? You have to be sure when you're administering a punishment or a discipline of some sort that it's seen as being, it's perceived as being a punishment on the part of the culprit, the person who's violating things. So reprimands may not work if the person perceives it as gaining attention. You're fining somebody. Does the fine work? Is the fine big enough to prevent somebody from engaging in that behavior again? If it's not, what does it matter? Library fines, most of the time, are not big enough to stop people from returning books late. Fining somebody for speeding, they found out, was not enough. You had to start adding points to the license to try to prevent people from speeding. And we still don't do that good a job because everybody speeds within limits. It's really, we really get nervous about people who are going way over the limit. So you have to make sure that it's actually functioning as a punishment. In the criminal justice system, there are instances where going to jail is not seen as a punishment for some people. It may be a way of gaining attention and gaining status, something to contemplate. So one thing that we need to be concerned about. The second thing that we need to think about is the timing delayed? Is it so delayed it's not going to have any effect? It occurs so long after the event itself that it really doesn't matter anymore. Another question. Person has engaged in the behavior, they've gotten whatever they wanted out of the behavior, and the punishment, if it comes at all, is just coming far too late to be connected to what's going on. Much better, as you can tell from the path that this conversation is taking, immediate punishment, discipline. And finally, is it strong enough? Seems like a strange question to ask. Is it strong enough? It has to be strong enough to catch somebody's attention right away. The mild slap on the hand can sometimes make the punishment worth the penalty. Well, I don't care. I'll take the penalty. As a matter of fact, in football there are penalties given out, and sometimes taking the penalty is part of the strategy, delay of game. We'll take the penalty for whatever it is, and it'll work out. So that penalty is almost meaningless. Fining somebody who is making millions of dollars, a couple $100 for not showing up, is clearly not strong enough. You're not going to catch somebody's attention for that. So you need to consider not so strong, obviously, that it's unreasonable, but strong enough to catch somebody's attention and say, hey, this hurts. Okay? It has to reach that level. So, concerns that we have. Still, there is a case against punishment. There are some arguments that we have to look at. From a supervisory point of view, it requires monitoring. You have to be really vigilant of your subordinates so you can see what they're doing wrong. Is it wasteful of your time? Is it okay for them to make some infraction so that you're not spending your time being so vigilant and monitoring them so closely? You need to spend your time on other things. And so maybe you have to let some infractions slip by. Another argument is that, well, punishment really only suppresses behavior. As soon as you turn your back, there goes the bad behavior again. So why bother punishing at all? There are reasons for doing that, and we will come to that. And finally, it has some very undesirable side effects. Clearly, one of the immediate side effects when you discipline is that somebody, the person you're disciplining, gets defensive. Why am I being singled out? Why am I being picked on? What did I do that's so bad? Wasn't my fault. Maybe gets hostile, angry towards the supervisor, and better yet, or worse yet, I should say, could get revengeful. I didn't get something. I'm going to take it out on somebody in the workplace. Much later in the semester, we will touch on violence in the workplace. But periodically, we hear about violent employees that come back to take revenge. That's big-time stuff. But smaller-time stuff, taking revenge. Well, you can take revenge by taking a few things home that don't belong to you. You can take revenge by not working so hard. You can take revenge by being uncooperative. There are lots of ways that, as an employee who's being punished or disciplined, you can take revenge. And then finally, I mentioned before the possibility of becoming fearful. And sometimes punishment happens inadvertently. An instructor calls on a student in the classroom. And the student responds, and the instructor's response to that is flip and cavalier and somehow embarrasses the student, puts the student on the spot. Well, it's an unintentional punishment, but it happened nonetheless. What's going to happen to that student next time? Not going to participate, not going to volunteer. And so you've, in that case, inadvertently punished the behavior that you wanted. Managers can do the same things. They can inadvertently turn off behaviors that they want. We want employees to participate. We want employees to offer suggestions. We want them to feel as if they own their jobs. And yet, sometimes things happen in workplaces where employees get turned off. Suggestions aren't taken seriously. You really work hard at something, and nobody seems to appreciate it. Doesn't seem to matter that you put in extra effort. What are you knocking your brains out for? So one of the unintentional consequences of punishment is that employees don't participate, don't make suggestions, don't feel as if they really have a stake in their jobs. They get alienated from their jobs. Nonetheless, it is essential to discipline in the workplace. Got to discipline. You've got to discipline to keep a sense of fairness in the workplace for those people who are really working hard, putting in effort, and other people are engaging in behaviors in which they're not doing their job or worse. You've got to discipline to keep that sense of fairness in the workplace. You sometimes have to discipline for safety, for the safety of the worker and the safety of the customer or the public. Example of something like that. If it is a sensitive position, somebody is a truck driver, a bus driver, a train conductor, working anywhere in transportation, operating heavy equipment, you can't let that person on the job, if that person comes in drunk or sick. They have to be in good condition in order to engage in that job. And so you have to really put in policies to ensure that this doesn't happen. One of the things that now happens in positions which are particularly sensitive to injuring the public is that there's random drug testing. After some bad accidents that occurred, it took us to this point to actually get the legislation in place. In a lot of positions, have to have it. You have to be prepared to discipline employees in that position for their own sake and for other people's sake. Same thing with safety on jobs. There are jobs in which you have to wear safety equipment. And people who are not adhering to the safety standards have to be disciplined because they can harm themselves and they can harm other people. But there are other jobs which are not so sensitive in which you're still going to have to discipline people. Somebody's working in some job where they're dealing either with customers internally or externally, and they're getting questions. People are calling up and asking questions about some kind of computer product. They don't know how to use it. Well, you can't reply to that person. What's wrong with you? Can't you read the simple instructions? Because you start to lose customers that way. Or you can't say to somebody in an internal situation, I can't handle your questions anymore, you're giving me a headache. You have to discipline those employees. They can't engage in those kinds of behaviors. So we can see a whole range of areas where it's absolutely necessary. You've got to do it. Unpleasant, you're going to have to dig your nails into your palms and go up and confront that individual. We're going to see how we can make it somewhat more effective. Effective punishment. Some qualities of it. First of all, try as much as possible to punish or discipline before the behavior becomes habitual, before it's so well established. Try to catch the behavior early. And if you can, try to catch the behavior before the person even completes it and gets the reinforcement out of it. How do you do this? Well, for people who are making too many long-distance phone calls, you can stop it altogether and say that office phones can't make long-distance phone calls. You can just engineer that possibility out of the situation. So you're not even going to have to discipline. But in some instances, the rule of thumb that you should use is catch the hand as it comes out of the cookie jar before the cookie gets into the mouth. Because if you eat the cookie, you've already had the pleasure of eating the cookie. You've had some reinforcement for it. try to intervene before the behavior is actually completed. So what do stores do to try to stop shrinkage of inventory? Okay, that is employees or customers walking out with stuff, otherwise called shoplifting. What do they do to intervene in this so that people can't walk out of the store with goods? Have you ever walked out of a store with something that either wasn't checked out or they failed to desensitize? And you set off all these alarms and you think, all right, they caught me, you know, here I am. It wasn't obviously designed for all the honest customers. Those tags that they have in there, and sometimes they're secreted in things, are put in to stop the smaller group of individuals, both customers and employees, who would find some way of walking out with the goods. If you walk out with the goods and you catch up with somebody afterwards, well, at least they've had the chance to wear the goods, or they've even gotten the excitement of engaging in shoplifting. For some people, this is fun. Let's see what we can get away with in the store. And so, high tech to try to cut down on the shoplifting. Some other behaviors that you might want to discipline. We talked about where it's absolutely essential and how you can do it. Well, let's go back to looking at how you make it effective. Make it quick. Do it as fast as you can, as soon as you can to the infraction. Okay, and make it strong enough. Don't wait. Somebody starts to come in late. One of the traps you can fall into as a supervisor when somebody comes in late the first time is to say, well, this employee hasn't come in late before. I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm going to let it ride. And then you see it happening a second time. You say, second time. Well, it's only the second time. Still easier to avoid the confrontation. Okay? And if you let it go to the third time or the fourth time, then you might begin to feel as a manager, somebody's starting to take advantage of my niceness. You know, I've been really nice to this employee, and I let it ride once, and I let it ride twice, and now it's happening 3 or 4 times. Why are they taking advantage of me? Now you've gotten yourself into a trap. It's going to be a problem. Now you're going to start to, as a manager, start to feel angry. And one of the things that might happen is that you might engage in behavior now towards the employee that is seen from the employee's perspective as being inappropriate because it's so extreme. You're really angry and you explode. Arbitrary. Why me? Nothing happened before. Kind of capricious. You know, flying off the bat, flying off the handle. That's why you want to deal with it quickly. You don't want to let it build up till you begin to feel, as a manager, angry. Make sure that you punish the act and not the person. Don't diminish the person for what they're doing. Don't demean the person. Particularly, well, in all situations, when you act quickly, somebody's made a mistake on a job and you have to correct the error. Point out the behavior that's wrong and say this behavior has got to be corrected. Not you're stupid. Not you're lazy. Don't do that kind of thing. Okay, focus on the act so the person can try to depersonalize it as well. This one is a toughie, and here's one where organizations run into a lot of trouble. Being consistent across time and people. An infraction is an infraction is an infraction. If you let somebody get away with it at one time and not another, you're going to be inconsistent. And go back to the time when we talked about last time schedules of reinforcement. Okay, having people on partial or intermittent reinforcement schedules. Sometimes they're going to get away with it, sometimes they're not. One of the things that you're going to do then is really encourage the behavior and not eliminate the behavior. So you have to be consistent across times. Okay, even though sometimes when things are really going good in organizations, you let things pass, and other times you might adhere to things more closely. be consistent. And be consistent across people. And this is really tough for managers because you have an employee who's been around for a long time, and the tendency is to treat that employee quite differently from an employee who's new on the job. So yeah, we do treat employees differently. And we'll see things in different situations. Essentially, we will attribute things differently depending on our knowledge of the person. To the extent that we make an attribution to an external circumstance, we're probably not going to be disciplining the person. If we attribute it to an internal thing, we're going to be more likely to discipline. Well, when are we likely to attribute it to something external? If somebody is acting quite differently than the person usually acts. You see it as being external. You probably won't discipline the person. But from the perspective of all the employees, somebody's getting away with it. You've got to be able to look at it from the other side. But you also have to use some common sense in the situation. So consistency across times and across people. The punishment itself should have informational value. You've got to tell people how to correct their behavior in the process of punishing them. You can't just yell at somebody. You have to explain why the behavior was inappropriate to the situation and how they can correct it, and start reinforcing the appropriate behavior situation. And finally, it works much better in a warm, supportive relationship. If you establish good relationships with your employees, you're going to be able to discipline them. The player's coach or manager can discipline the players better than the one who is somehow more remote from the players on the team. Because the players know that this person is supportive when support is needed, okay, and wouldn't come and say something unless something needed correction. So keep all of these things in mind in terms of engaging in using punishment. Okay. Very quickly, in summing things up, how to avoid punishing so that it appears arbitrary, capricious, and way out of proportion to the situation. Sum it up. Discipline the first time you see the unacceptable behavior. Don't wait for a behavior to go away. Don't engage in wishful thinking and think, well, this won't happen a second time if I ignore it. Okay, because from the employee's perspective, you allow it to happen once, there's nothing wrong with it, so the employee can do it again, coming late. And there are lots of rewards for coming in late. You get to sleep later. You don't have the same pressures on you. Okay, so, and you're not working as long in the workplace. So you have to tackle these right away. And certainly when you see dishonesty, you have to tackle it right away. Discipline every time you see it. Again, don't think that you can not discipline sometimes, okay? Discipline dispassionately. Try to keep that anger in check, okay? And speak to the act and how it can be corrected, okay? And finally, discipline with enough strength so somebody knows that they're getting some kind of discipline, okay? And not the gentle slap on the hands or attention. And now we want to move to the last model of learning, observational learning. Learning by watching. Very efficient way to learn. This model of learning, unlike the other two that we described, came out of the work not from dealing basically with animals in the laboratory, as did classical conditioning, Pavlov and conditioning the dogs, or operant conditioning, and the name associated with that would be somebody by the name of Skinner, in the conditioning he did of rats and pigeons and chickens and all kinds of animals in the laboratory. Observational learning, the name we most often associate, is somebody by the name of Bandura, and he did his work with children. And he understood that there was so much to be learned in early childhood that you simply couldn't account for all of learning by classical or operant conditioning. And that as humans, we learn an awful lot just by watching other people. We don't need to make our own dumb mistakes. We can watch other people's dumb mistakes. And we can watch where other people succeed and engage in those kinds of behaviors, knowing that they will bring us some kind of reinforcement. So we don't need to, in order to learn, directly experience a reinforcement or a consequence. We can look at the consequences of other people's behaviors to figure out what we need to avoid and what we need to engage in. Observational learning has some distinctive aspects that sets it apart from the two previous models of learning or theories of learning that we considered. One is that it has a cognitive component. Thinking counts. Expectations count. If we go back to classical conditioning, it didn't require any thinking at all. We're dealing with a reflex behavior. It's all automatic. And while thinking may take place in operant conditioning, there's no need to refer to it at all. All we need to know are what are the antecedents of a situation and what are the consequences. And we don't need to know what goes on in the mind at all to understand operant conditioning. Apply the right consequences and you should be able to shape the right behavior. But observational learning, it really relies on expectations of getting reinforcements. We look at what somebody else does and we think that if we engage in that behavior, we'll get the reinforcement. So you need a mind in this one. It plays a role. It also relies on a concept of vicarious learning. Vicarious, learning through other people. And its companion piece, vicarious reinforcement. Sometimes just copying somebody's behavior feels good. Nobody is directly reinforcing us, but modeling or associating with certain teams makes us feel good. That's our team. Our team won. Our team? You're not a member of the team. Nobody even knows you're a fan of the team. So how come you feel better when the team wins? And why do you feel depressed when the team loses? Okay, vicarious reinforcement. It's that identification plays a large process in all of this. Motivation clearly plays a role in all of this, and we're going to take a look at a particular component of motivation called self-efficacy. The learner is active. Remember that in classical, the learner was passive. In operant and in observational learning, the learner is active. And it's a very efficient way to learn. If you think about everything that we learn by observing, we don't even think that we're learning. There's a kind of effortlessness in the process of learning. It just seems to happen. Okay, so take a look at some of the important components of it. Vicarious learning. Vicarious learning involves modeling. We're going to model our behavior after some significant person. Who is this significant person going to be? Hard to tell. Surely early in life, our parents are our major models. And later on, teachers, friends, in the workplace, could be supervisors, could be coworkers who are succeeding. Outside the workplace, could be prominent figures who we think are somehow good people in life, and we'd like to emulate or follow their behavior, or are popular for one reason or another. Okay, something about these people whose behavior we choose to emulate, to copy, catches our attention. Somehow we think it's important. And we're able to, so attention, cognitive, it has to catch our attention, okay? And we have to be able to remember the behavior that we want to copy. So there are going to be certain distinctive behaviors that we're going to be copying. And if you look at people who are prominent out there and people who want to copy their behaviors, we can point to people in the media, in television, in the arts, in politics. And we can see the followings that they have, or in sports, the followings that these people have. Surely Madison Avenue knows about it as they get product endorsements and will want to copy the behavior of this person. Somebody uses Nikes. And because we want to be like this person, we'll use Nikes. Okay, we will copy their behavior. And in the very process of copying the behavior, we get some kind of vicarious reinforcement. It just feels good to copy the behavior of that person. I'm going to use one example, which I think most of you can relate to, of a phenomenon of modeling of behavior that has gone on for decades now. There's a rock group out there called the Grateful Dead. They have their camp followers that model their behavior. Why? What is it they're getting out of it? Something must feel good in the process of doing it. They're not getting the same attention nor the same money that the rock group gets, but somehow they feel they're getting attention somewhere along the line. And just being like that person, somehow you catch some of the limelight in just copying that person's behavior. So it's a powerful way of learning. And there are trendsetters out there. We behave like the trendsetters. Modeling. What kinds of models work best? Well, it helps if they're attractive and if they're powerful. Okay? It also helps if we can somehow identify with the model, and the model is successful. Attractive, powerful, can identify with them in some way, and they're successful. Vicarious learning also requires that we have the ability to do it. We're not going to be able to learn to copy somebody's behavior if you just don't have the ability. I'm not going to be able to ever skate like Wayne Gretzky or even Peggy Fleming. That goes back a ways. Any of the Olympic ice skaters. I'm not going to be able to do it, okay? I could get the same kind of ice skates. I could get the same kind of skating outfits, okay? It's not going to help, okay? Just not going to work. Even if I practice at it, it's not going to work. So it's probably not going to be somebody I'm going to emulate. And it's going to be somebody who's going to be able to do something I can do, okay? And you need to have with it the vicarious reinforcement. If somebody's going to engage in that behavior, they have to get some kind of reinforcement for doing it. Okay? All of that goes for successful modeling. Another aspect is motivation. Self-efficacy plays a role in all of this. We're not going to engage in the behavior unless we think we can do it. Well, how do we come to think we can do it? Self-efficacy is that judgment that we make that we have the ability to do something. Plays a large role in observational learning. Clearly, the thing that feeds in most would be something called positive enactment. You did it before, you know you can do it again. Bringing somebody through a program in gradual stages, a training program, so you build up the skills in somebody and they feel successful on it rather than throwing the person to the sharks, so to speak, sink or swim. So engaging in behavior is going to be the thing that builds up self-efficacy the most. But sometimes you start out and you've never done it before. Why even try? Well, if there are people who are similar to you who are doing it, models in the workplace. That's why we talk about the whole notion of the need for models for groups that are not represented or are underrepresented in the workplace. So they can look around and see that people similar have achieved in the workplace. coaches, somebody out there who says, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. Get at it and do it. And so we begin to think about managers taking on the coaching role as well to encourage people to do this. Self-control. Arranging the work environment so negative behaviors are reduced, positive ones are increased. Engineer your environment so that you get the rewards you want and you eliminate the behaviors you don't want. Studying, get away from that telephone, get away from the television, engineer your environment, and reward yourself. One of the ways you can reward yourself is to engage in more preferred activities, the things you really like doing, only after you do something you don't like to do. After you study a certain amount, you can go down and call a friend. Okay? Structuring the environment. Self-control for project management. Engineer the situation so that you have points that you have to meet along the way, so that you don't get to the end of the project and go, how am I ever going to get it done? Okay, sub-goals to get you there. You can do this in lots of situations. Structure your environment so that you have opportunities to succeed and not opportunities to fail. Self-control, self-reward, self-management of behavior. Before we sum up where we've been today, a problem that we need to deal with in observational learning. It's very efficient. It works really well. We see it working in the workplace with mentoring, where people have someone who guides them. But the problem is that we copy somebody's behavior in entirety. And so if they have a lot of good qualities, we'll copy that. But we usually emulate the bad qualities as well. If you're somebody who's a real go-getter out there, I want to be like that person. Person puts in lots of work. Well, the person also cuts corners here and there and is a little shady on the expense account. And you find that out as well. But you say, gee, this person gets so much recognition. I can be like that person. I can do the same thing. If you're using observational learning in the workplace, and it is used in training situations, you need to select mentors very carefully. That's one of the areas where it's used. And so, where have we been today? Well, we've looked at traps and fences, behaviors we shouldn't engage in and behaviors we should. We've looked at problems in punishing and disciplining. We've looked at problems in how to make it more effective. And next week we go on and we tackle, or next time, motivation. What needs in the workplace govern behavior of employees? Question?